Hi everyone, welcome to our first lesson of film history, and today we'll be starting with the origins of cinema. So the purpose of this course is to give you all just a little more in-depth understanding of the history of cinema that you may not ordinarily find out. So we'll be going a bit more in depth today with just the very first origins. So the topics that we're going to cover today are the precursors of cinema and filmmaking. We're also going to cover important technological advancements, important figures, the genres of early films, the exhibition history, formal aspects of film that we'll use to analyze future lessons, and then we'll analyze early cinema according to those formal aspects, and then we'll look at some films to watch that are basically examples of early cinema. Okay, so let's start with the precursors of film. So of course, as we know, before film comes photography because film is basically tons of photographic images. So on the left, you see like the very first image, or what we believe to be the very first photographic image ever taken. In the middle, you see optical toys like the zoetrope and the praxinoscope. Basically, they made images look like they were moving. Usually, they were like little drawings, like you can see on the inside. They looked like they were moving as you rotated them around, and as you looked through one of the slits as they went around, it looked like the thing was moving. Or you could also look above it and look at. You could also look above it and see that it was moving. And then on the very far right, we have projection systems like the magic lantern. And that was important in, projecting the images that we have, images that we record. The magic lantern itself, I don't believe projected any moving images because as you see, it's very like you have to move the film in front of the actual light. So if someone was manually doing that, in order for the eye to perceive movement, there would have to be 12 frames per second, and it's unlikely that you could move that image fast enough for the eye to perceive movement. Okay, and the last thing we're going to really cover is the photographic motion studies, which are Edward Muybridge, which we'll go on over in the next slide. So in the photographic motion studies were basically Edward Muybridge. There are two different stories that you may hear. One of them is that Muybridge basically made a bet with someone that I believe Muybridge was on the side that horses' legs do come up when they're galloping because all the current perceptions of the time were that a horse always has one leg on the ground. It never gallops with all legs off the ground because that's just insane. And in order to prove that person wrong, Muybridge basically set up 12 cameras along like a horse racing track and had the cameras fire when the horse moved past it, and that produced 12 images of a horse running. And then he was proven right. Horses do lift all feet off the ground when they're galloping. And the other story is that Muybridge was basically just mad at the inaccuracies of horse drawings and paintings of the time. So he wanted to prove that their legs do come off the ground. And he did the same thing, just what I mentioned before. He set up the 12 cameras, they fired, and then he tried to show people, and they basically denied that it was real, denied everything. So he did multiple motion studies just to prove that he was right. And now we accept that as fact because we know that horses' legs come off the ground. And there were different types of motion studies. There are even human motion studies, just as you can see on the right. Basically, someone tumbling pretty much is something that is interesting to analyze from a photographic standpoint because you get to see all the different ways that the human body is moving. So there are motion studies of humans as well. Okay, so some important technological advancements that made film more feasible include, as I said before, photography. This is the first, or what we believe to be the first, photographic image ever taken. We also have the photographic gun, which is on the bottom left. Basically, it fires multiple images at once and allows you to capture like multiple images like while motion is going on, and it looks pretty hilarious. So, okay. And then in the middle, we have on the middle left, we have basically an exhibition device where you basically look through the device to see the projection of images. And as you can see on the inside of that device in the middle, there are reels of film all strung up that you can like rotate through. And one of the important things is that I just wanted to note is that in order for the eye to perceive movement and to be like tricked into perceiving movement, because that's all film is tricking us into believing that things are moving, that something is physically within a scene. It's all just like tricking the mind. So in order to trick the mind, there have to be at least 12 frames per second. Otherwise it looks choppy and the eye can't be tricked into believing that that's actual motion. Okay, so let's talk about the important people of film. A who's who of film. You probably don't recognize all of these people, and you probably won't recognize them by faces, but by name, you probably, as you go through your film education, will learn about all, most if not all of these filmmakers and or innovators or people who create things. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the main standouts. So we have the Lumiere brothers, who were the earliest of filmmakers. They're also credited with making early versions of like cameras, basically, that can record motion and film. And they also have early shorts that are very important to the early cinema. And along with this, we also have, but they were in Europe, I believe France, and in America, Thomas Edison was basically creating the kinetograph and the kinetoscope. So the kinetograph, when you see graph, it usually means like recording or like graphing motion. So the cinematograph and the kinetograph are both cameras to capture the motion of something. And Thomas Edison also created the kinetoscope, which the kinetoscope, when you see scope, it usually means a way to view something. So the kinetoscope, and in the next, on the right side, you see the Sklandowski brothers, who created the bioscope. So the bioscope and the kinetoscope are ways of exhibiting footage that has been captured. So yeah. Oh, and as you can see, I only have one brother on here. I don't know why they don't have multiple images of the brothers, but this is the only image of. I think this is actually Max, because I don't think Emil has any pictures available of him. Okay, so let's talk about the genres of early cinema. So the genres of early cinema are basically, because early cinema is usually so short and doesn't always have a narrative, it's very difficult to have so many genres compared to what we have now. So one of the main genres of early cinema is actualities, which capture like scenes of daily life. Like, and these are like, the Lumiere brothers have a lot of actualities. Sometimes they're even staged, sometimes they're not even capturing actual life, they're capturing like people, it's basically actors performing. So actualities basically show everyday real things happen even if they're staged. So there are examples like someone watering the plants in a garden, someone feeding a baby, just anything normal that you can think of is technically an actuality. Okay, so then we have topicals, which are reporting on current events, maybe a war, maybe something like that. Yeah, topicals were usually played, especially between things, just to give an update of what's going on currently. And you can see like evidence of that in older films. Like I know Citizen Kane, I think, starts with what would be considered a topical. So then we have scenics, which are tourism films, basically that capture vistas that people may not be able to go to. And it allows you to sort of imagine that you are there. And in the bottom middle, we see an example of what I would consider to be a scenic. And it's like waves crashing against a wall. It's like very, like you just capture the beauty of nature and a scene that not everyone would be able to experience. Okay, then we have fiction films, which are films that are meant to entertain. Usually they're like sort of comedic, or they follow like someone on a journey. There aren't too many fiction films at the time because there aren't too many narratives. So like any fiction films would be like a bit later during this era of like early cinema, things like Buster Keaton and like the Musketeers of Pig Alley sort of things. And silent films, I included this as a genre, but like they're usually not really silent. They're usually accompanied with music, but you know, they might have like inner titles and everything where dialogue is being expressed. Trick films from people like George Méliès, who George Méliès was a magician turned filmmaker, basically using film and like early editing techniques to, you know, make his magic tricks even more of a spectacle than they were in person. Basically, he's considered like the grandfather of special effects because of this. Um, Very good. Would recommend him. As you can see, top right, this is a Méliès short. Very interesting use of film, and yeah, widely known. Okay, so the exhibition history. So where did people actually go to watch these films? So they usually went to arcades where there are kinetoscope peep shows, sort of like, as I mentioned before, as we looked earlier, there was someone like peering down into a kinetoscope, basically watching, having a private viewing of a film or a like moving image. We'll call it a moving image for now still. And there were arcades that had these machines lined up for people to come in and pay and then watch the films. There was still no sound, I don't think. There probably wasn't any sound. Um, then we have examples like vaudeville theaters, where they were the main site for films in the early 1900s. Basically, there would be a projector, you project it onto a screen, and then you watch it. It's the whole thing. Then you have things like Nickelodeons, which are cheaper, much cheaper than vaudeville, and usually I believe Nickelodeons were traveling, and they're usually paired with other attractions. So they could be paired up with amusement parks, traveling exhibitions, and you would just have like sometimes films go in between them to keep the audience entertained while the next thing was set up. Okay, so now we'll go to the formal aspects, the five main formal aspects of analyzing films that we'll use to analyze films in the next um, lessons that we have. Okay, and these five formal aspects are narrative, mise-en-scène, cinematography, editing, and sound. So starting with narrative, we're going to look at how and what story is told, or if there even is a story being told. For mise-en-scène basically means everything within the frame, and that could include setting, props, costume, acting and gesture, and lighting. And all of these end up affecting the audience's psychological perception of the film itself. So we're going to look at how they basically affect the audience's perception. Then we have cinematography, which is everything involving the camera, including angles, distances, movement, lenses, film stock, everything. And this is just like a way for us to analyze what cameras have evolved, how cameras have evolved at the time, and to basically understand how things have changed and what changes were made available by the evolution of the technology. Okay, then we'll also look at editing, which is how shots are put together. Is there fades, are there dissolves, or are they just straight cuts? And then we have sound, which is basically in a lot of early silent film, it's going to be accompanied sound. So there's not really a distinction between diegetic and non-diegetic sort of thing, unless there are sound effects. Yeah, but we're going to look at diegetic, non-diegetic, music, dialogue, etc. Okay, so let's begin by analyzing early cinema according to the main five aspects. So with narrative, narrative within early cinema is relatively simple if there's any at all. Pig Alley is one of the most complex ones. Pig Alley and also Great Train Robbery are also very complex in terms of early cinema. But usually like most of the short films or like shorts that were made in early cinema, they usually what they filmed as a story could be considered a scene within our understanding of cinema, because they were so short and they were relatively narratively simple, and they could be isolated, and we generally understand the scene. Okay, mise en scène. So in mise en scène, everything was usually kept realistic unless it was a theatrical setting where the theater performers basically performed at the camera instead of an audience. So that was the only time where it wasn't realistic. And this basically, by capturing the realism, especially in things like actualities, it allowed the audience to sort of see like, oh, this is just real life, as opposed to taking them to some fantastical world like George Méliès, which we see on the top left, where basically he transforms a set into a different world and takes the audience somewhere completely different from what they're used to. Okay, the cinematography is usually pretty plain, due to the limited advancements at the time. So cameras had to stay usually stable. Usually everything was angled to catch the action. There weren't really any real movements because like you had to keep the camera stable in order to capture images at the time. Editing, usually simple cuts used, if any. I think Millier used some dissolves, but that's like starting to become a bit later in his filmmaking, where you use like a lot of dissolves in order to hide cuts, and to add some special effects into his filmmaking. Sounds sounds usually short. The films at the time were accompanied by live music. There was no dialogue, unless there were intertitles spaced between. Okay. And next, let's look at some examples of early cinema. Let's begin with The Sprinkler Sprinkled. This is a Lumiere Brothers short, and you can see it's like a comedy, and it is staged, of course. So yeah, let's just take a look at that. The next example that we're going to look at is The Life of an American Fireman. This one is a little bit longer, so we're going to only watch a little clip of it. And in this clip, we're just going to like see one little scene, and we're going to look at how it's starting to form, like early cinema is starting to form its own entire narrative. Even though we don't get things like who characters are, we get the general gist of a situation, and we start forming individual sections of what could be a greater cinematic narrative. In the next one, we're going to go over Musketeers of Pig Alley. So Musketeers of Pig Alley is a it's one of the more complex, as I said before, it's one of the more complex early cinema films because it has characters. We follow individual characters. We see they all end up intersecting, like all of their stories intersect, and it's a lot longer than the previous films that we've looked at. So, and I think it's pretty complex, and it's definitely showing the advancements of the time. I'm just going to give you guys a few more films to watch that are pretty iconic for early films, especially like the Lumiere shorts. All of them are very, very popular, like Arrival of a Train, Demolition of a Wall. All of these are very, very like iconic films that you might want to know as you go through your own film education. So yeah, so yeah, and I highly recommend you at least watch The Great Train Robbery, Musketeers of Pig Alley, or Sherlock Jr. All very, very good, especially Sherlock Jr. Buster Keaton is amazing at doing his own stunts, so very interesting to watch. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, just reach out to me or reach out to any of the teaching artists. Yeah, and I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you look forward to the next lesson.